Good afternoon and welcome to today's Exeter Institutogram conversation with me, Sajjad Rizvi, from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Today we'll be in conversation with Khodadad Rezakhani from the University of, from Princeton University. Khodadad is a late antique historian, and we will be talking about things to do with late antiquity, the study of really how we conceptualize a notion of global history. So I'm just waiting for Khodadad to... Ah, yes, there you are. Hi, Khodadad, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Sajjad.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think the last time we met was probably in Berlin a while ago. But
It was
it's...
quite a while ago,
yeah,
4 years
yeah.
ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a while, and of course, any sort of current possibilities wouldn't have happened because of COVID. I mean, I was supposed to have been in the States last month, and then of course I'm supposed to be going to Mesa, but I doubt Mesa is going to happen. So anyway, in the
Yeah,
absence of that, we
the
can at
problem.
least do
Yeah,
this. So I'm looking forward to this.
yeah.
Um, I described you as a late antique historian, um, and so I guess the point to start with is how did you or why did you decide to become a late antique historian, and how did you conceive of that? What brought you to this particular field?
I'm actually very, very interesting question. Do you have my voice and sound all right, by the way?
Yes, yes,
Yeah. Okay. Um, well, on that, I was always interested in history. I was one of those nerdy history kids as a child. I always found history interesting, always read history, and generally found the period that corresponds to the end of the Roman Empire and coming of the Germanic populations very interesting. So I actually surprisingly found my way into this by doing Scandinavian Viking history.
okay,
That was my initial motivation. And I actually, the first part of my education too, I started doing Merovingian and early Viking history.
right,
And, that's part of a greater conversation that I would someday like to have of being typecasted into being an Iranian, and you should do
yeah,
things that you have better access to because of the language and because of different things. So I ended up really applying my Scandinavian history interest and period to the area that quote unquote I knew better, although I didn't necessarily.
yeah, yeah,
I had to learn the whole thing. But in general, it was because I liked this bigger pictures and this
mm,
larger global historical looks. So it appealed to me the most, the period appealed to me. I like the connection across the time to the early Islamic period. I always was very uncomfortable about this entire late and pre-Islamic and Islamic Iranian history, the division of particularly Iranian history into this very
mm,
artificial thing. So I found the concept very interesting. And specifically, I have to say that the motivation was my PhD supervisor, Michael Moroney.
yeah,
He and Patricia, I'm sorry, he and Claudia Raff basically started teaching me about late antiquity. So as a concept, I really learned it from Michael and Claudia.
right.
But I think my interest was always in the period and in that general area.
Yeah. And of course, now you're in the late antiquity place because, it's associated with Peter Brand more than anyone else, I guess, the very notion of late antiquity.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
It's
certainly
very
for...
much the epicenter of it. John Holden, who retired but who is still there, and a number of very good late antique historians, early Christianity, late Roman historians are there. So yeah, I'm very lucky in that sense.
Yeah. And also, I guess what ties, these various kind of areas of research, whether it's Viking history, whether it's, Europe in the Dark Ages, as it used to be called, etc., and even the early Islam or the late Sasanian period is this kind of problem with sources, right? So, we
Exactly.
have very little to go on. So historians have to be quite creative to try and make sense
Yeah.
of what's going on. How are people conceiving of this period? What sort of historical memory do people have of it? How do these narratives get constructed?
Yeah. And I think everybody thinks of their own field as particularly this. I might, as I certainly think of history, modern profession of history generally,
Mm,
and what I'm most interested in, global history specifically, as being a little bit of a connective as well. As you said, the problem of sources basically makes it impossible for us to be classical historians working off of texts.
mm,
In a lot of areas, my first English book, I worked on East Iran, with Afghanistan, Central Asia, where narrative histories are basically null. There is nothing there. So you have to work off of different source material, which brings you into fields of numismatics and
mm.
archaeology and other specified specialist fields, which, yes, at one point dismisses you as a generalist, but on the other hand, becomes the tool of a historian to create the narrative. And I think late antiquity in particular, because of its insistence on different types of history. Yes, because of Peter Brown, we have had this overemphasis on history of religion and Christianity and institutions of the church,
Yeah.
obviously. But that by itself makes it necessary to look at different sources and different approaches, which I think, again, makes even late antiquity quite an interdisciplinary, connective sort of field to be in.
Yeah, and that's the kind of development you find even in the study of early Islam, with people looking at rock inscriptions and what the material evidence is of buildings and early mosques, palaces, other kinds of
Precisely.
so and that seems to be in many ways it's those particular areas which are a bit more vibrant than maybe the study of the literary sources. So
Exactly. Yeah, epigraphy, particularly the early Arabic epigraphy, we are all following it, is becoming its own field and quite interesting. And I think
yeah,
eventually it will change at least the history of early Islam, if not the study of Islam itself. Yeah, those kind of tools need to be developed, and I'm sure we will get into it. But that's exactly the issue of microhistory, the being able to use those tools. Now you have to be able, quite a bit about epigraphy, about numismatics, about archaeology, about sigillography, various these fields that act as tools in order to be tied together
yeah.
to create what historians are supposed to do: create a story, create a narrative, give
Yeah.
an overview. Yeah, in whatever scale we are really talking about. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, like, you could maybe take a cluster of, say, some of these inscriptions, just like, for example, just north of Medina. And, they often have lots to do with kind of senses of local belonging. They have things to do with calendar, the notion of the year, the ritual year, even. And they often have a wider sense of a certain cosmology as well, which is terribly interesting as well. So, I mean, we'll come back to these questions of method and micro, macro, global history.
Yeah.
Let me just quickly, and we'll ignore Ihab's little comment at the moment because we know all this stuff. I'm talking about what is famous. Um, just to
Yeah.
the specific issue of what you're working on at the moment. So if we start with what you're doing at the moment, your research, and then we can go to this bigger questions of the method.
I'm actually right now trying to finish my second English book on the Silk Road and the idea of the Silk Road. So it's a continuation of this first one. And the first one, I tried to establish some sort of a narrative for the history of Central Asia. And in this one, I'm trying to understand the thing that I think Warwick Ball put it the best way. It has become both a gravy train and a bandwagon, the Silk Road. Everybody puts anything they have on it, and whatever they want, everybody jumps on it as well. And so I'm trying to contextualize Silk Road as means of really creating a modern historical narrative by the Europeanists and by the sinologists. in order to talk about the connection between the two cultures, while in fact what is going on there is being largely dismissed as, the oasis in this step where people stopped, roads that are talking about, and places are getting less attention. This is the thing that I'm trying to finish. What I am really, and that's almost done, so the research and writing from done. What I'm actively on a daily basis now doing, I'm actually working on material for the period of conquests in Mesopotamia, in Islamic conquest in Mesopotamia, which is original field of Sasanian history. I am trying to develop a way of looking at the period between 628 and 637, the start of the conquest, and from the end of the Byzantine Sasanian Wars to the start of the conquest, or not the start of them, the culmination of the earliest stages, and work off of that, basically on the transition from the late antique, from the Sasanian period to the early Islamic period. And those terms that I just used them, I'm sure would cause a problem of what we're going to talk about. So,
I mean, that's really interesting, because that's also where, it's a lot of the so-called controversies are right now, like whether it's, Parvane Pushkariyati's book, or whether it's, the shoemaker. And I keep on thinking Sydney Shoemaker, but he's a philosopher. Stephen Shoemaker, sorry. Certainly if you were to speak to some of those, the classic question of did these conquests start in the lifetime of Muhammad, is one of those kind of interesting things. And the perennial question that we always set for students, which is, so how did it happen so quickly? We always
how did it happen so quickly?
I
think my answer for it is that I'm not going to give away the final thing, because as I said in one of the papers I wrote about the subject, I think if the answer I would have for it is probably when I'm 80 and I have written already 100 articles and 3 books about it. But I think the thing that motivates me the most is if it is a little hard to believe, it probably wasn't how it happened. And as you were talking about the lack of sources, most of the sources we have for the conquest are later narrative sources written 200 years, 300 years after the events. And I think what I'm inspired again by my ex-supervisor Morini's work is I'm looking at it from a material history, economic history point of view. Matt the other night said we are all materialists. We should acknowledge it. I am unabashedly materialist.
I mean, he meant it in a bad way, but
I know. I've had that argument with him that it is in a good way that I'm a materialist. I acknowledge it and embrace it. I am looking at it from an economic history point of view. And the transition, because other than the wars happening so quickly, I think the most amazing thing is that the new system takes root so quickly as well. The rise of the Islamic Empire and the golden age of Islam, whatever you want to call it, whatever happens in the early Abbasid period, is relatively short period after the conquest and the upheaval that is supposed to be. So I think my entire answer to it goes from the fact that I think the process is a lot more gradual. It has a bigger background than we acknowledge, largely because the documents that we look at and the point of view we look at is mostly Mediterranean. And in this case, I want to insert my field of Iranian studies and say that there is a whole perspective to be considered, which is the Sasanian Iranian perspective, which because of the lack of sources, as you mentioned, we pay less attention to, and we are not really acknowledging that what is happening on this side of the Euphrates is a lot deeper than we think. At the time that the Prophet Muhammad is moving from Mecca to Medina, 621, all of the borders of the lands that he is familiar with are controlled by the Sasanians. Sasanians are in control of Egypt. Sasanians are in control of Syria, obviously Iraq, and even Yemen. The only place that the Muslim world, that the early Islamic world has a way outside the Sasanian world is Ethiopia, which is exactly where they sent their first envoys.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the Hijra and the early Islam is happening in a very much of a Sasanian context, and I might be hyperbolic about it, but I think that is something that we should acknowledge and consider.
Yeah, no, I think that's well taken, and certainly, I remember a slightly more polemical context where a colleague was saying that we sometimes forget that in this early period, places like Iraq, etc., were very much part of the Persian Empire. So, he was trying to say nothing changes, but
Yeah.
I think it's a fair point to kind of understand that, because we often are used to this idea of the Byzantine, Sasanian conflict, and recently also there's been a lot of interest in the chapter on Rome in the Quran, and what's going on there. Is this a prophecy, or is this some sort of like reflection of it? So we often sort of see that as some sort of equal relationship. It's an equal fight between the Byzantines and Sasanians, and eventually, they cancel each other out, and the Arabs see an opportunity, right? That's a pretty standard kind of narrative that we're given. But I
Yeah.
think what you're suggesting is potentially a different way of looking at that.
Yeah, I'm suggesting that the fighting forces of the Near East at the time are in one way or another engaged with the Sasanians. That they are either fighting on the side of the Sasanians, because another thing that comes from the other way around of the Perso-centric Iranian nationalist way, the idea is that Iran is the borders of Iran right now. So those Sasanian Persians who were conquering Egypt and Syria, they were coming, I don't know, from Isfahan or Mashhad. No, they are coming from Iraq. They are coming from southern Syria. They are the soldiers. They are the ones who are fighting. They are, and which means that if we read all of the recent scholarship on the presence of the Arabs in the Near East, whether Peter's idea of they recognize themselves as Arab or not doesn't matter, but that these tribal groups, they are the fighting force. They are the people who are actually doing the wars on behalf of the Sasanians. And then the question for me becomes, what happens when in 628 the commander-in-chief, the Sasanian emperor, is killed? Because that's one of the things. Sasanian control of the Near East doesn't collapse. There is not like they are piece by piece defeated and driven back. The center is hit. The emperor is removed and killed. And we know that up at least 3 years after his death, his soldiers are all around. So the question becomes of these forces being involved, what happens to them? And how are they managing the fact that they are almost professional soldiery, and now they need a new patron in order to continue their business of conquering? And I think I'm giving out the answer there. The new patron is
I think that's I think that's fair enough, because it's sometimes you get I guess the kind of the professional culture, so to speak, of the individuals is something we often forget. I mean, people either look at it must be some sort of religious zealotry, or it must be economic benefit, right? Taxation and so forth. But clearly there's a lot more going on. And if all is fighting and conquering, and because that of course gives you a certain status and position in society as well, then you're going to find clearly the patron who can help you fulfill that.
Precisely. Yeah.
And of course, I mean, looking at that in this kind of broader picture, say from Central Asia to Egypt, I think also begs this kind of question of I guess the global history of this period, right? Or how we kind of look at this, and some sort of connections as well. I mean, I'm very much interested in connected history, but I think connected history has become increasingly very much a case of intellectual history. But we're
Mhm.
talking about much more than that. I mean, maybe you can say something about how you think connected history is different from global history, and then we can talk a bit more about global history.
That's actually a very, very interesting question. I have to say that I really have a lot of thinking to do about that more than talking. That has been a question for me in a personal level because my global history comes from London School of Economics. I was
Yeah.
among the first cohort of people ever getting a degree, a master's of science in global history.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I was transplanted to Los Angeles, where I started, where one of the members of my committee was Sanjay Subramaniam, the
Yes.
connected history person,
Yeah.
and which both sides see themselves as complementing each
Mm.
other and being in touch. I think that's exactly where my issue of the methodology comes, because
Mm.
global history is, first of all, seems to be, by its most ardent sort of promoters, to be very closely related to globalization and thus to modernity and thus to the coming of the modern and the global powers. This is certainly something that Sebastian Conrad says in his book on what is global history. And I
So
always found it
basically, like
obviously
an
odd.
18th. So that's basically kind of an 18th century after sort of phenomenon, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. 18th century. Sebastian himself works on Meiji Restoration and Japan in the 19th century. You know, that sort of seeing of globalization. And I always obviously found it unappealing in that sense because I was being excluded from this because obviously my interest lied before the year 1000. So I'm 900
Mm.
years too early, 800 years too early for this.
Yeah.
So I found a little solace in Sanjay's concept of connected histories. But as you
Mm.
say, the connected history seems to be taking, the old-fashioned idea of influencing each other and reading off of each other. I think too much of a case-based study, maybe connected history, needs a global history contextualization. Maybe
Mm.
maybe that's how I would put it. That
Yeah.
connected history might work as a particular way of looking at global history,
Mm.
a particular tool of global history itself. For me, it has been very useful because what I'm often working on is connected histories. I'm working, you are naturally, by the force of the sources, you have to work on things such as Sasanians and Romans, Sasanians and Byzantines. In my books, the East Iranians and the Chinese, the East Iranian and the Sasanians, the East Iranians and the Indians. This is something really that's got my attention and drove me into this, of trying to bring global history to my period and define it as a way of looking at the history of a village
Mm.
from a global sensitivity, that you
Right.
can
Yeah.
work on something really, really micro and minute, but still have the concern in a larger sense. It again was also inspired by being around Carlo Ginzburg at UCLA,
Mm.
and his work, which is microhistory
Yeah.
per se. So that brought to me the idea that there doesn't need to be a conflict between the two ways of looking at history. That the methodology
Mm.
of connected history and the theory, or let's say, I don't want to give it a religious undertone of ideology, but a general outlook of global history with the methodology of connected history in a controlled way, taking micro-historical cases, taking the tools of microhistory into consideration, into use, in order to create parts of a bigger picture. In this way, I hope, at least, I have taken something of global history's concern of the actions that happen in one place and the consequences that are seen beyond this is probably why I also have an interest in Silk Road, because one of the ideas of my Silk Road was nobody sells anything in Dunhuang thinking it will end up in Antioch or in Constantinople. So bringing evidence that there is a Chinese piece of silk in Constantinople or in Antioch or in Rome doesn't do anything really for me as far as that kind of connection goes, because the actions that our individual takes, that miller in northern Italy that Carlo writes about, he is not thinking that it's going to have global consequences, and the global consequences might be really minute or slow to disseminate, but they do. They, after all, do. And anyway, yes, depends on the scale, depends on what you're working on. So my approach has been to strengthen my toolbox of microhistory in order to create pieces of a puzzle that I'm hoping eventually all of us together in the Republic of Letters, in the Republic of Academia, together can put together. So that's why I so with intense interest look into the stuff that Ahmed Jalad or yourself or Maran for Putin or our young colleague Mehdi Shadel and others are doing, who is not specifically related to what I'm interested in or what I'm working on, but I think everything that I do has some sort of connection to things that you do and others do as well. And we can't live in isolation. So I think it's partly for me a personal attitude that I can't work in isolation. I have to work with other people. I have to develop my ideas out of seeing other people work and how they're approaching their questions and things. And you know, I could pay a lot of tribute to friends. Your colleague over there, Emily, has always she was my PhD mate at UCLA, so I've known her for ages. Her little work on a little text, but that little text has so much consequences, has so much to say about the bigger picture. So you can work on a little text and think that that can describe such a big picture that you can't ignore that picture. You have to know everything about the context of that picture. Of course, it might dismiss me as a generalist, as somebody who refuses to specialize, but I think in the long run, that's for me is a way of organizing my thoughts, while I, in reality, end up me working on a couple of texts as well.
Sure, and I think you know, to a certain extent, that's just the way you know, we're trained as historians. So we of course have our particular kind of interest, but we have this wider curiosity, and we very much play off on others. So you know, you can't be kind of divorced from these wider trends. So whether these trends are, you know, older trends such as the Annales school, or whether it's kind of microhistory, or whether it's connected history, or whether it's even decolonization, you know, which I go on a lot about nowadays, and I think rightly so. You know, that's part of the wider context in which we're living in, and you can't really silo away your research from that. I mean, if I can ask you, in terms of you know, microhistory, so sometimes it's a study of a small community or village or something, and some of you know, Hisham Jaid's work points in this direction, but it strikes me that a study of a place like Kufa would be very useful, right? Like a proper, like very deep, thick description of Kufa, because you know, Kufa is of course this one of the first important garrison towns, but it's not out of nowhere, because it's part of this wider vicinity of a place which used to be called Hira, and has always been like a center of that part of what is now Iraq. So you know, that could actually be a very interesting one. And then when you look at the relations within that, the way the marketplace works within Kufa, the way in which the military aspects work, the administration, Islamic law, of course. Islamic law, pretty much a lot of Islamic theology certainly arises out of Kufa. You know, so it tells you quite a lot about that early period.
Yeah, actually, urban history is fascinating. I have, because of, again, friends, been very curious about it and have always wanted to get into it. Sarah Savant once correctly and very wisely guided me towards working on the history of Qom, because we have this very amazing text, History of Qom, which was written early on and has these amazing stories of early settlements and how the locals are dealing with the migrants.
And it has accounts of my ancestors, the Rezavi Sayyids.
Really?
Yeah, because the Rezavi Sayyid started in Qom, so you know.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. That's actually really interesting. Yeah, so all of these things that it has, and now we obviously have these amazing Pahlavi documents, which are coming from the area of Qom, and some of the same people are mentioned in the Pahlavi documents. Now we have first-hand evidence of the people where history of Qom. We only had the narrative much later.
Yeah.
So yes, urban history has always been very interesting for me. You know that Isabel Toral's book on Hira, that was written in German. I don't know if it was ever translated into English. But Kufa and Basra and the early Islamic garrison towns, which, as you said, they have a lot of context. Yeah. They are there. They are places where everybody's coming from. Kufa is interesting because that's the first capital outside Medina, right? That's where Ali moves the capital. Yeah. And so they are and it is interesting that it is in the context of Hira, which again, a lot of the early narratives of Islamic history from pre-Islamic period, I think are actually coming from Hira. That's one of the reasons that in the section on Sasanian history, At-Tabari tells the history of Hira flawlessly in connection with Sasanian history, because I think it is the history of Hira. The entire Tabari's entire Sasanian history is actually Sasanian history from the point of view of the people of Hira. Somebody was writing it there. Hence, details that you don't get for any other Sasanian emperor, like Bahram V being raised by a local emir in Hira, which means that that is what they are most interested in. So yes, of course, urban history like that should be really, really useful. It should be something that we should take a lot more seriously. I don't know exactly the sources on Kufa, but I know the sources on Hira. We basically lack good archaeology. That's one of the things. Establishing the place of Hira, figuring out the network of Hira. Because, so like in things such as Chronicle of Khuzestan, which I worked on for a while, we have a mention of a Christian monastery in Hira, which seems to be a major institution. We have evidence of where this might be, but we don't really have good location for this. We don't know the entire landscape. We don't know the land behind Kufa, to borrow from Adams. We don't have the proper context of this. And then the relationship across the desert. So Greg Fisher's book on the Arab clients, it needs also archaeological, material, physical backing, which we lack. Plus the fact that the sources that we have are often not that interested in urban history. Urban history is a background, they mention it. And even when they do mention it, modern historians are obviously not that interested in really focusing on that. People like Hugh Kennedy have done a great job of looking at the formation of the early Islamic cities. And of course, Islam as an urban thing has been considered. Again, more in his work on the transition in Iraq is very important. But looking at specifically how Hira becomes Kufa and what is the role of Najaf here, and you know, holy places and the shifting of the city's focus, and you know, I still read very simplistic explanation that why do they come up with the garrison city like Kufa? Oh, because they don't want to do their prayers on a Ghaspi piece of land, which is nonsense, because they do on the Ghaspi piece of land everywhere else. That's a completely colonized, now going back to your decolonization, colonized way of looking at Islamic history. But we don't really know, right? We have to know, why is Kufa there, and why is Hira there, and what happens to Hira?
I mean, I
things
think
of the sort. But
I mean, certainly some of that, I think this is where, you know, we have some good opportunities. I mean, in terms of Iraq, I mean, Kufa University is one of the better universities in Iraq. And they have a very good archaeology and history department. So some of it I think can be with partnerships, because even when you walk around, I've walked around a bit in Kufa, not recently, but I have, and sometimes you kind of wonder, okay, so how is that like that now, and how might it have been, say, even 600-700 years ago? And you know, if you when you just look at the physical kind of topography of it, and the distance, I mean, the distance from Najaf, of course, is not great. Um, you know,
Yeah,
nowadays it's basically the same city. Um, but of course, before that, it would have been. And so it's interesting to see the dynamic, and even local kind of memory. I mean, you know, Kufans and Najafis don't like each other. So, you know,
yeah,
it's a sort of interesting
very true.
element of
Yeah,
that. Where does that come from? You know, does that have kind of does that have sort of resonance of, you know, the new Kufa versus Hira and stuff like that? I mean, it's all kind of interesting questions that
yeah.
could be. Um,
We
by
have
the
a
way,
very good scholar in, I think, University of Najaf, Nasir Kalbi, who is actually a
yeah,
Sasanian historian. He
mm,
does Sasanian history. So we have even the local expertise. Yeah,
yeah,
partnerships would be great. I would like to explore that if possible.
yeah.
Yes.
And I think increasingly this whole idea of, you know, taking archaeology seriously, and not just having to fall back on the old kind of colonial digs in the area, of which, of course, there are many in Iraq and others before that. I think that would be okay. So Salam has just said there's been recent digs in
In
Hira, yeah,
in 2000,
undertaken
yeah,
by the Germans.
yeah,
Um,
Germans have them, but I haven't seen them published other than the very early reports. I haven't actually seen them coming out. But thanks very much, Salam. Yeah.
of course, if people have questions and comments, do bring them. I guess. Uh, I mean, connecting this to a question which was asked earlier about, you know, so what does Khodadad think of the study of early Islam as it is at the moment? I mean, maybe if I could put it in a slightly different way, are there, do you find this kind of approach of microhistory being used in the study of early Islam, and how might we do this, and how might it kind of link to what you think is good in the field, if I can put it that way?
Um, Yeah, I do see it actually. I still worry about the application of the larger picture to the
Mm,
study of early Islam. This there is a lot of really good micro-historical work being done on changing the details of the narrative. Because as you know, a lot of our narratives are based on older, again, we are using this term probably half jokingly at this point, but colonized, colonial
mm,
ways of looking at Islamic history. Of these big narratives that we need to defeat, and we need to create new things out of. I
yeah,
think in the early Islamic history, a lot of good is being done in that aspect of it. But I worry about the bigger picture. I worry about the frameworks.
mm,
Frameworks are, again, politically oriented. There is you know, when you talk about, you know, anything that has to do with Iran right now, everybody like me has to qualify that you are not looking at it from a, you
yeah.
know, Iranian
The
colonialist
eternal
imperialist.
Persian Empire. Yes.
The eternal Persian Empire. I never believed in that. I'm not a fan of it. I am one of the historians who actually doesn't really like the people I study. I don't think Sassanids were very nice people. It's not that point of view, but it's the big elephant in the room that is being missed. And I see that the current constant framing of these things is ignoring geographies. And that's really what worries me the most, and what is my concern the most. That by looking at these certain sources, by having certain types of funding coming from certain sources,
Mm,
you would naturally have to focus on things that forces you to unnaturally ignore other things that are related.
mm,
So whether it's a Byzantine historian looking at what happened to the Byzantines or
yeah.
what didn't happen to the Byzantines, how come Byzantines weren't taken over like the Sasanians were?
Mm,
Or early Islamic historians differ depending on their own interest of what happened that Islam won, or what happened that I don't know what, but on the Iranian nationalist part, what happened that we collapsed against these Arabs coming from the middle of the desert. Everybody has preconceived notions, and I see that these continuing. So microhistory, I think, is actually here very important because it changes certain parts of our narrative. It's certain things that these narratives are built on get dismantled. I'm not going to name any names, but I think many of our colleagues are doing great jobs of this. I'm going to be giving an example of my own. And that is that for me, it is always interesting that in the Shia narratives of Karbala, one of the big bad guys is Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, who is the big governor who mobilizes everything. It's very interesting that Ubaidullah is half Persian. And his father, Ziyad ibn Abihi, the illegitimate son of Abu Sufyan, was also probably half Persian.
Right.
And on the coins of Ubaidullah, he writes his name in Pahlavi, but he doesn't write it as, he doesn't write it as Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad. He translates his name into Middle Persian, and he writes it as Ubaidullah Ziyatan. The first part is obviously his name. So, but he's not writing his name as Yusuf Jafarzadeh. He's translating it as Joseph Jefferson. He's translating his name in that sense. I find that very interesting because, in this entire narrative of obviously Shiism being owned by Iranians, so whoever is against early Shia people like Imam Hussein is a foreigner. It's quite interesting to think that for the Iranian nationalists, what would their reaction be to that? The person who's most involved is actually probably the most Persian of all of these people going on. So I think these little micro things, figuring out the genealogy of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, is something that helps to change those bigger narratives. But I still worry about whether we have a good framework for that big narrative, whether we still have gotten over some of those colonial narratives, colonial frameworks, and their modern reinforcement because of the subjects that we have fallen into, whether you are an Islamic historian or a Byzantine historian or an Iranian historian, which this third one doesn't really make sense anyway. What does it mean to be an Iranian historian? And things of the sort. So microhistory, I am very optimistic about. Macro history, I would like to see more attention to its tenets by the practitioners of early Islamic history. As you said, nobody's really comfortable with Anal school and with these bigger framings. It doesn't really take on. We constantly refer to Hodgson and Hodgsonian world historical look, but I don't necessarily see it being applied very effectively on an everyday basis on a lot of the research that I read.
Someone's actually just asked you what's the evidence for Ibn Ziyad maybe half Persian. Yeah,
I would have to. I'm not going to say it because I'm actually.
You don't want to give it away. You don't want to give it away.
No, on what he's writing, obviously, is coins. But the early narratives, he is constantly mentioned. Ziyad ibn Abi, he is mentioned to have a Persian wife. And Ubaidullah is constantly said, and it's actually the mother of Ziyad himself, which is not certain, because sometimes it's said that Abu Sufyan has a Persian whore, sometimes it's a Byzantine whore. I'm not sure exactly which one of it is.
I mean, the Ibn Marjana thing, so I mean, I guess.
Exactly, Ibn Marjana, exactly. So it's I think Ubaidullah's background is pretty certain. It's Ziyad's that is not that certain. And things. I was just giving that an example. I'm including that in a little paper I'm writing right now. But as I said, I think those kind of micro things are helping create a basis for the bigger narratives to change and slowly, hopefully, progress.
And also, I mean, like some of this kind of, I guess, rather small scale focus to reveal a larger picture. You see it, for example, in Jack Tennis's new book, where
Yeah.
it's very much looking at particular communities, what's happening in certain villages over time, and you see this gradual development. So it's the same, I think. We have this question of, so how do we get to, from say 633 to all these guesstimates about how Iran, whatever Iran is suddenly mainly Muslim by about 1,000
Yeah.
US 1,000, right? So how does this happen? And of course, the obvious kind of longue durée thing to do would be to focus on certain points
Yeah,
and see
exactly.
how things develop in those contexts. Why do people change? What happens? Is it about conversion? Is it about settlement? Is it about other demographic features? Is it about the change in the social political environment? I think that's the sort of thing which does need to be happening. Yes.
Yeah, that actually crossing over a bit over the Sasanians to a later period. Since Dick Bullett's study of the conversions in Iran, we have had a lot of arguments about that point, but I don't think anybody has made a significant contribution to that. But I think, again, not to get to details, on a macro level, one of the issues is, again, the dominance of concepts we have. We still have this Iranian intermezzo concept going on, which basically tries to put anything that happens after the death of al-Mutawakkil into a reactionary thing. This is when the Arabs are getting weak and Persians are coming on. And as my very good friend and inspiration, Alison Baca, argued, well, you could call it an Armenian intermezzo as well at one point. There are Armenians coming on. So if you want to give it, but we have those kind of things of trying to figure out how does it happen that by the year 1000 the Sasanian Empire is mostly the part of the Islamic world and a very active part of the Islamic world. It's a full participant in the experience. It's not a side thing. I would say that an important part of that is getting over those kind of persistent narratives as well, the Iranian intermezzo. The bigger idea of the Abbasid golden age and collapse, the general understanding that the Buyids came and destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. Well, they did continue for another 300 years.
Exactly.
So something happened there. That wasn't necessarily the case. So, again, I think, and of course, those narratives are coming from nationalistic backgrounds. They're coming from various sorts of Islamophobic understandings of early Islamic history. But as you pointed out, microhistories, again, specific events. What really happens after Mutawakkil dies? Or rather, what happens in much earlier period, in 750s? We constantly talk about the Khurasanis and the Abbasid revolution. How is it that the people from that part come along and change the face of the politics in this region? And how come this farthest eastern reach of the Islamic world becomes the means of the most central change in it, in fact? I think that was also one of my motivations for my book on East Iran, on Central Asia, and thing like Khorasan is everywhere in Islamic history. How come we don't see it in Sasanian history? How come we don't see it before? Micro, obviously.
And I mean, within that, I mean, that you have this whole kind of the figure of Abu Muslim himself. I mean, is a fascinating figure. Of course, as we know, in the later period, certainly in the Safavid period, becomes a very controversial figure as well.
We need a biography. We need a good biography.
Or at the very least, a good film.
A good film. Thank you. It's something that was done for that Michael's biography of Al-Ma'mun. We need something like that, and even more detailed, about a proper biography of Abu Muslim.
Because also there's so much material on Abu Muslim. I mean, obviously a lot of it is very kind of partial in one way or the other, but there's a lot of material on Abu Muslim. So there was someone who just asked this question about the Prophet's letter to Khosrow Parviz.
Oh, it's those kind of details, if we could probably take outside, because I don't want to be talking.
I know. I mean, it's the whole question of I mean, there are people who've talked about the correspondences of the Prophet and stuff, and the.
Hello.
diversity of that. But yeah, we can leave that. I think there's certainly this creation of a certain Sasanian myth in early Islamic historiography, right? So the whole idea of the prophet being born in the age of a just ruler, and then the palace kind of cracking, that's of course a very important element of Muslim historical memory.
Yeah, and Sarah's idea of how they thought of the Sasanian past, or even of a particular city. Yes, very much. Sasanians become the quintessence. I always point out that the whole reputation of the grandest of the Sasanian emperors, Khosrow I and Shervan, is actually a Muslim creation. It's for the Islamic Muslim rulers, the Islamic period, that he is the perfect ruler. And the idealization of the Sasanian past is very much a part of an Islamic understanding and formation of the idea of kingship for them. Yes, it is something that again, I would go back to the issue of narrative and colonial narratives of we own those narratives. Somebody made a very interesting comment here. I would just go from this to that. See, Sasanians are Iranian. They are owned by Iranian nationalists. And naturally, the people who don't feel any love for Iranian nationalism, Sasanians become the big enemies. They are the ones who were conquered. They are the ones who are destroyed by these Muslims who now understand what is properly going on, and they take away the bad things of the Sasanians and, probably don't even care about it. But this is the problem, that nobody owns anybody. Somebody made a very cool, semi-funny comment. I realized we have a football team called Abu Muslim Khorasani. It's the main team in Khorasan, right? Yeah. Of course, he's the most famous person with the last name Khorasani on him. Yeah. So there you go. You understand. But see, Abu Muslim in the Iranian narrative is an Iranian nationalist rising against Arab oppression.
Yes. Yeah.
Which, if you read Islamic history, it was like, okay, where exactly do you get that from? Because he is the one who has Arab rule, right? If you want to put it in that sense. So again, these things have to be. We have to look at. There is a whole argumentation about the burial place of Abu Lolo, the person who killed Caliph Omar, and its grandiose position in a village in Iran, and that entire narrative that we killed the Arab ruler. That's not how the sources are looked at, and that's not how things are actually really imagined. So yes, decolonizing the narrative is the biggest thing. Simcha Gross is asking a question. I'm wondering if he's serious. Khosrow's reputation, Pahlavi literature elevates him in various ways, though this may be yes, exactly, Simcha. It is, because Khosrow is owned by Pahlavi literature, but I would totally imagine as a reaction to the Islamic narratives of him. I have a feeling, and I'm not going to open a new can of worms here, but I have a feeling that Khosrow's reputation is not actually that positive within the Sasanian, within the people of the empire that he ruled. He gets reinvented in some senses. I shall argue. Me and Simcha talk about these things anyway, so I'm going to ignore.
I'm just aware of time, so I think we should try and bring this to a close. I guess so. You're going to finish this kind of account of this pivotal period.
Yes.
So will it be coming out soon? Are we talking a few years, or this is the big project?
It is a big project. I have come up with a few articles already. One of them just published a few days ago. One of them is going to come out soon. Yes, I am trying to put together right now this economic background of the war of the 602-628, the Sasanian Byzantine background, and put it in the geographical sort of environment of the Near East.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, the connection went a bit. Yeah, can you hear
Yeah.
me now?
No, no. I would just quickly wrap up. I'm doing this as a backbone of a future project of establishing what happens when the new system comes in.
Right.
So
Okay.
I am trying to first figure out what is happening there on the ground. So you could say, in a sense, more in Iraq after the Muslim conquest. I'm
Okay.
trying to do Iraq and Syria before the Muslim
Okay.
conquest,
Cool.
and then marry those two and bring out something that, okay, so what happens in this bigger picture? What happens from, I don't know, Tashkent to Fustat
Yeah.
after this thing happens? So, as usual, as you would expect from me, a big picture.
Of course,
A
I
lot
expect
to
nothing less. Expect nothing less. Well, thank you for this, Khodadad. I think it's been
thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you for those who've been watching. I will, as I've been doing in my strange way, be putting this up on the YouTube channel that we have at the Institute. So it just remains for me to thank you, Khodadad, and those watching. I'll be back tomorrow with Janita Karac, and we'll be talking about the Bosnian Hajj. So